My name is Sarah. I used to think that love was something you earned through silence, through making yourself small enough to fit into the spaces others left for you. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but mostly I was wrong about what I deserved. The call came on a Sunday morning in March. I was in my kitchen, still in my pajamas, watching the steam rise from my coffee cup when my father's voice cut through the quiet like a blade through silk. His tone was casual, almost bored, the way someone might discuss changing their car insurance or switching grocery stores. "We've decided to sign over your portion of the family property to your sister," he said. No preamble, no explanation, just a statement delivered with the emotional weight of reading a shopping list. She'll make better use of it. You're never around anyway. The words hit me like a physical blow, but my body didn't react the way I expected. I didn't gasp or drop the phone or feel my knees buckle. Instead, everything inside me went very, very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before an earthquake, when even the birds stop singing because they sense something terrible approaching. I tried to speak, but my throat had closed in on itself, muscles constricting like a fist. The silence stretched between us, filled with 32 years of unspoken truths, of being the daughter who asked too many questions, who made choices that didn't align with their vision of who I should be. I wasn't around because I had spent the last 5 years working 2 jobs and studying late into the night, trying to prove I belonged somewhere, even if it was just in my own life. But he wouldn't understand that. He had never understood that. My mother was on the extension. I could hear her breathing, shallow and careful, but she didn't say a word. Not a whisper of disagreement, not even a sigh of resignation. That silence of hers was louder than any insult they could have hurled at me. It was the sound of complicity, of years of choosing the path of least resistance, while I flailed against currents that were always meant to pull me under. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes the most painful truths need to travel the farthest to find the people who need to hear them. Sarah? My father's voice crackled through the phone, impatient now. Are you there? I'm here, I managed, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, like an echo bouncing off the walls of an empty house. Good. The paperwork will be filed next week. Your sister will handle everything from here. Of course she would. My sister, who had mastered the art of being exactly what they wanted, compliant, predictable, safe. She had learned early that love in our house came with conditions, and she had met every single one without question. She said yes when they suggested her college major. She married the man they approved of. She lived 3 blocks away and called every Sunday and Thursday like clockwork. She was the daughter who fit perfectly into the mold they had created, while I had spent my entire life trying to break free from it. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to reconsider or try to explain all the ways this felt like having my heart torn out through my throat. Instead, I said something that surprised all of us, including myself. Okay, just that. One word, delivered with a calmness that felt foreign in my mouth. I could hear my father's confusion in the pause that followed, the way he had probably prepared for tears, or anger, or desperate pleading. He had gotten none of those things, and it left him off balance in a way that felt like the first small victory I had ever won against him. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching the coffee grow cold in my cup. The apartment around me was small, but mine, filled with books I had chosen, and furniture I had saved for, and pictures of friends who actually wanted me in their lives. It wasn't much, but it was real in a way that my childhood home had never been. I realized something sitting there in that quiet Sunday morning light. I hadn't lost a share of property. I had lost an illusion. The illusion that there was still some version of me that could win their approval, some way I could twist. myself into a shape that would finally earn their love. That illusion had been killing me slowly for years, and now it was gone, cut away with surgical precision by my father's casual cruelty. The relief was unexpected and overwhelming. I didn't call them back. I didn't storm over to their house demanding explanations or justice. I simply stopped. Stopped calling on holidays. Stopped sending birthday cards. Stopped pretending that the distance between us was temporary or fixable. The space that had always existed between us just became real, acknowledged, named. And in that space, something strange and wonderful happened. I remembered myself. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers my father had brought home from work, reading contracts out loud because I loved the way the language fit together like puzzle pieces. I understood clauses and exceptions better than fairy tales, could spot loopholes and inconsistencies that made him laugh and shake his head. "You should be a lawyer," he used to say, and for a brief moment, his voice would carry something that might have been pride. But that was before I grew up, before my questions became challenges and my curiosity became defiance. Before they decided that a daughter who thought too much was more dangerous than one who thought too little. I threw myself into work with a focus that surprised my colleagues. The nonprofit where I worked was small but ambitious, fighting for policy changes that actually mattered. I had always been good at research, at digging through documents that most people found tedious, but now I approached it with something approaching obsession. I stayed late, came in early, buried myself in files and reports and legal briefs until my eyes burned and my back ached. My supervisor, Margaret, started leaving coffee on my desk in the mornings with little notes. "Remember to eat," or "The work will still be here tomorrow." She was the kind of woman I wished my mother had been. Fierce and intelligent and completely unafraid of taking up space in the world, she fought for her team the way I had always dreamed someone would fight for me. 3 weeks after the phone call, Margaret called me into her office. I expected another gentle lecture about work-life balance, but instead, she handed me a thick folder with my name on it. "I'm recommending you for the senior policy analyst position," she said. "The board meeting is next month, but I wanted you to know first. The promotion would mean more money, more responsibility, more of everything I had been working toward. It should have felt like celebration, but instead it felt like proof of something I had always suspected. I was capable of so much more than my family had ever believed. The part of me that had spent years trying to shrink herself small enough to fit into their expectations had been holding back the part of me that was meant to soar. That night, I went home to my small apartment and opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. I sat on my couch, surrounded by law books and policy papers, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in who I was becoming. But even as I celebrated this small victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, some piece of the puzzle that hadn't fallen into place yet. I had always been good at seeing patterns, at finding the connections others missed, and there was something about my father's casual dismissal that felt too easy, too clean. So I did what I had always done when something didn't make sense. I started digging. The next Saturday, I drove to the county courthouse and spent the morning in the records office, pulling every document related to our family property. The land had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down through a complex trust that my great-grandfather had established in the 1940s. I had heard stories about it growing up, how he had been careful to protect the land from being broken up or sold off, how he had wanted to ensure that future generations would always have something solid to stand on. I spread the documents across one of the long tables in the research room, arranging them chronologically like pieces of a puzzle. Property deeds, tax records, trust documents, amendments, and modifications spanning decades. It was tedious work, the kind that required patience and attention to detail, but I had both in abundance. And there, buried on page 47 of the original trust document, written in the careful legal language of a man who understood that families could be just as dangerous as strangers, I found it. A clause. Rarely invoked, almost poetic in its precision. It stated that any transfer of shares or interest in the trust property required unanimous written consent of all legal heirs and beneficiaries, including any children or descendants of the original grantor, regardless of their current relationship with other family members. Any transfer made without such unanimous consent would be considered null and void, with the affected shares automatically reverting to their original designation. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding harder with each pass. My great-grandfather, a man I barely remembered but who had apparently understood something fundamental about power and family dynamics, had built in a protection I never knew existed. He had made it impossible for anyone to be cut out without their explicit agreement. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of the courthouse research room, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, and not quite joy. Something quieter but more powerful. The recognition of my own worth reflected back at me through the careful words of a man who had died when I was 7 years old. He had seen me coming somehow. Had anticipated that there might be a grandchild or great-grandchild who didn't fit the mold, who asked inconvenient questions and made choices that challenged the status quo. And he had protected that hypothetical future person, me, with the precision of a master craftsman. I made copies of everything, organizing them into neat folders with careful labels. Then I went home and spent the rest of the weekend researching trust law, reading cases and precedents until I understood exactly what those 47 pages meant in practical terms. Monday morning, I called a lawyer. James Morrison had handled real estate and trust law for 30 years. His office was small and cluttered, filled with the comfortable chaos of someone who had seen every possible variation of family drama and property disputes. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow, legal pad, his expression carefully neutral. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied the documents I had brought. The silence stretched for several minutes while he read, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for him to tell me I had misunderstood something, that the clause didn't mean what I thought it meant. Finally, he looked up and smiled. Not a big smile, just a small upward curve of his mouth that somehow conveyed both sympathy and satisfaction. "Your great-grandfather was a smart man," he said. "And your family's lawyer either didn't do his homework, or your parents didn't tell him the whole truth about getting your consent. So the transfer isn't valid? Not even close. In fact, if they try to proceed with this, they could face significant legal penalties for attempting to defraud a trust. Your great-grandfather wrote some very specific language about penalties for bad faith actions." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't even realized was there. What do I need to do? Technically? Nothing. The transfer is void whether you act on it or not. But if you want to make sure everyone understands the situation clearly, I can send them a letter explaining the legal position. Sometimes people need things spelled out in official language before they really grasp the implications. I thought about my father's casual dismissal, my mother's complicit silence, my sister's assumption that she could simply take what was mine without consequence. I thought about all the times I had been told I was being too sensitive, too difficult, too much. "Send the letter," I said. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspended animation. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, watched television, lived my normal life while waiting for the explosion I knew was coming. James had sent the letter on a Tuesday, certified mail, return receipt requested. I imagined my father signing for it, opening it at his kitchen table, his face changing as he read the careful legal language that dismantled his certainty. The call came on a Thursday evening. Not from my father this time, but from my sister. Her voice was tight with barely controlled frustration, the careful composure she usually maintained cracking around the edges. "Really, Sarah? You're going to make this complicated?" I was stirring pasta sauce when my phone rang, and I kept stirring while she spoke. The motion was soothing, rhythmic, giving me something to focus on besides the familiar tone of condescension in her voice. "I'm not making anything complicated," I said. "I'm just protecting what's legally mine." "But you don't even care about the property. You never come around. I never what?" The words came out sharper than I intended, years of suppressed anger finally finding their voice. "I never played the game the way you wanted me to. I never pretended that being ignored and dismissed was the same thing as being loved." The silence on the other end stretched for so long I wondered if she had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more uncertain than I had ever heard it. "Mom and Dad are really upset. They don't understand why you're doing this." Of course they didn't understand. Understanding would require them to see me as a person with legitimate feelings and rights, rather than an inconvenient obstacle to their plans. It would require them to acknowledge that their casual cruelty had consequences. "They'll figure it out," I said, and hung up. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes from carrying a weight you didn't realize was yours to bear. But I also felt something else, the quiet satisfaction of standing up for myself for the first time in my adult life. Margaret noticed the change at work. She didn't say anything directly, but I caught her watching me sometimes with an expression that might have been approval. I carried myself differently now, spoke up in meetings without apologizing first, offered ideas without prefacing them with disclaimers about how I might be wrong. The promotion was officially announced 3 weeks later. I cleaned out my old desk and moved to the corner office with windows that looked out over the city. From my new chair, I could see the courthouse where I had discovered my great-grandfather's gift to me, and beyond that, the highway that led to the family property I had never really thought of as mine until someone tried to take it away. My new responsibilities included overseeing a team of junior analysts, and I found that I was good at it, good at seeing people's strengths and helping them develop skills they didn't know they had, good at creating the kind of environment I had always wished I could work in, one where questions were welcomed and different perspectives were valued rather than feared. One of my new team members, a recent graduate named David, reminded me of myself at that age. He was brilliant but unsure of himself, constantly second-guessing his instincts and apologizing for taking up space. During our first one-on-one meeting, I watched him shrink into his chair as he presented his research, ready to fold at the first sign of criticism. "David," I said when he finished, "stop apologizing for being right. Your analysis is solid, your recommendations are sound, and your presentation was clear and thorough. Own it." The transformation was immediate and beautiful. His shoulders straightened, his voice grew stronger, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked me directly in the eye. I recognized that moment, the exact instant when someone realizes they don't have to make themselves small to survive in the world. Summer turned to fall, and I heard nothing more from my family. No angry phone calls, no guilt-laden emails, no attempts at manipulation or reconciliation. Just silence, which felt appropriate somehow. We had been strangers living under the pretense of being family for so long that the honesty of actual estrangement was almost refreshing. I spent my free time exploring parts of the city I had never seen before, taking long walks through neighborhoods where no one knew my history or my family's expectations. I joined a book club, started taking pottery classes, made friends who knew nothing about trust funds or family property, or the complex mathematics of conditional love. For the first time in my life, I was simply myself. Not the daughter who disappointed, not the sister who didn't measure up, not the woman who couldn't quite fit into the spaces others had carved out for her. Just Sarah, with her own apartment and her own career and her own choices about how to spend her time and energy. Then, in November, James called. "I thought you should know," he said. "Your family's lawyer reached out. They want to schedule a meeting to discuss the trust situation." My stomach clenched involuntarily. What kind of discussion? The kind where they acknowledge that they can't proceed with the transfer without your consent, and they try to find a way to save face while backing down from their position. I had imagined this moment dozens of times over the past few months, but now that it was here, I felt strangely calm. Not excited, not vindictive, just ready to finish what had been started that Sunday morning in March. When? I asked. Next Friday, 2:00, at their lawyer's office. I took the afternoon off, work, and spent the morning getting ready with the same careful attention I would have given to any important professional meeting. I chose a navy blue dress that made me feel competent and confident, styled my hair in a way that suggested I was someone who should be taken seriously, put on the pearl earrings I had bought myself when I got the promotion. The law office was in an older building downtown, all dark wood and leather furniture designed to convey tradition and authority. I arrived exactly on time, neither early enough to seem eager, nor late enough to appear disrespectful. The receptionist showed me to a conference room where my parents, my sister, and their lawyer were already seated around a polished table. The scene was smaller than I had expected somehow. My father, who had loomed so large in my childhood imagination, looked older than I remembered, his face drawn with the particular exhaustion that comes from having your certainty challenged. My mother sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes focused on something just past my left shoulder. My sister looked up when I entered, then quickly looked away, her usual composure replaced by something that might have been shame. Their lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stood to shake my hand. "Ms. Henderson, I'm Robert Patterson. Thank you for coming." I took my seat across from my family, James beside me, and waited. The silence stretched for several long moments before Patterson cleared his throat and began to speak. As I'm sure you're aware, there have been some complications regarding the transfer of trust property that your parents initiated earlier this year. After reviewing the original trust documents, it's become clear that the transfer cannot proceed without your written consent. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the subtext. Your family screwed up, and now we all have to pretend this was a reasonable misunderstanding, rather than an attempt to disinherit you without your knowledge. The trust language is quite specific, James added, his tone equally professional. Any transfer of shares requires unanimous consent from all beneficiaries. Since Ms. Henderson is a named beneficiary under the original trust, her agreement is legally required. My father shifted in his chair, the first movement any of them had made since I entered the room. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the casual authority I remembered from that March phone call. We weren't trying to. We thought you wouldn't. Want to be involved with the property management? You've never shown any interest. There it was, the same justification he had used 8 months ago, but delivered now with the uncertainty of someone who had discovered that their actions had consequences they hadn't anticipated. You never asked me, I said quietly. You never asked if I wanted to be involved, or what my interest might be, or how I felt about any of it. You just decided for me. My mother looked up for the first time since I had entered the room, her eyes meeting mine with an expression I couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe, or recognition. But she still didn't speak. So what happens now? My sister asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Patterson consulted his notes. The attempted transfer is void, so the property shares revert to their original distribution as outlined in the trust. Ms. Henderson retains her full interest as a beneficiary. And if we wanted to proceed with some kind of modified arrangement? My father asked. Something that would work for everyone? I looked at him across the table, this man who had shaped so much of my self-doubt and insecurity, and felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. He looked smaller now, diminished by the failure of his casual cruelty to achieve the clean resolution he had wanted. Any changes to the trust would require unanimous written consent from all beneficiaries, I said, including me. The implication hung in the air between us. I had the power now, not just the legal right to block any changes they might want to make, but the knowledge that they needed something from me for the first time in my adult life. I could have used that power to hurt them the way they had hurt me, could have demanded apologies or explanations or acknowledgments of all the ways they had failed me as a daughter and sister. Instead, I stood up. "I think we're done here," I said. "James will be in touch if you need anything else." I walked out of that conference room without looking back, past the leather furniture and the intimidating law books, out into the crisp November air, where my breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the wind. I didn't feel victorious exactly, but I felt something better. Complete. The weeks that followed brought a strange kind of peace. I threw myself into my work with renewed energy, leading my team through a major policy initiative that would expand healthcare access for low-income families. The project required months of research, coalition building, and careful negotiation with stakeholders who didn't always want the same outcomes we did. But I had learned something valuable about persistence and patience from my family situation. I had learned that sometimes the most powerful action is simply refusing to accept someone else's version of who you are or what you deserve. I applied that lesson to every aspect of my work, pushing back against dismissive comments in meetings, insisting that my team's research be taken seriously, refusing to let our recommendations be watered down for the sake of political convenience. The policy passed in February, and Margaret took me out for dinner to celebrate. We sat in a small Italian restaurant near the office, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about the impact the new policy would have on thousands of families who had never met us, but whose lives would be a little bit easier because of work we had done. "You know," Margaret said, raising her glass, "when I first hired you, I thought you had potential, but I underestimated you. You don't just have potential, you have power. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it." I thought about that toast later, walking home through the city streets I had learned to love over the past year. I thought about the girl I had been, always trying to twist herself into shapes that would earn approval from people who were never going to give it. I thought about my great-grandfather, who had somehow seen across decades to protect a granddaughter he would never meet from family members who valued compliance over compassion. Most of all, I thought about the moment I had stopped asking for permission to exist in the world as myself. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected email from my sister. The subject line was simple. "Coffee?" We met at a cafe halfway between her house and my apartment, neutral ground where neither of us had the advantage of familiar territory. She looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. We ordered our drinks and sat across from each other in silence for several minutes before she finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said, about playing the game." I waited, not sure where this conversation was heading or whether I wanted to participate in it. I realized I don't actually know who I am when I'm not trying to be what they want me to be, she continued. "I've been so focused on getting their approval that I never figured out what I actually wanted for myself. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that the dynamic we had grown up in had damaged both of us, just in different ways. It's not too late, I said. To figure out who you are, I mean. She smiled, a small, sad expression that reminded me of the sister I had played with as a child, before we learned that love in our family was a competition with only one winner. Maybe not, she said. Maybe it's never too late to start over. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating around years of resentment and misunderstanding, finding small pieces of common ground. When we parted ways, I didn't know if we would become friends or remain polite strangers, but I felt something shift between us, the possibility, at least, of something different. My parents and I never spoke again, not out of anger or spite, but because there simply wasn't anything left to say. They had made their choice about who I was allowed to be in their lives, and I had made mine about accepting or rejecting that limitation. We existed in the same world, shared the same last name, but we were no longer bound by the pretense that blood relationships automatically create love or understanding. I found peace in that separation, the same way I had found peace in my small apartment, and my meaningful work, and my friendships with people who chose to know me, rather than settling for assumptions about who I should be. On the first anniversary of that March phone call, I drove out to see the family property for the first time in years. It was smaller than I remembered, less grand than the place that had loomed so large in my childhood imagination. But it was mine, legally and unquestionably, protected by the foresight of a man who had understood something fundamental about family dynamics and the importance of safeguarding the vulnerable. I sat in my car at the end of the long driveway, looking at the house where I had learned to make myself small, and felt nothing but gratitude. Not for the property itself, but for the journey it had set me on, the journey that had led me back to myself. Some people inherit money or land or family businesses. Others inherit expectations or traditions, or the weight of previous generations' dreams. I inherited something different. The fire to reclaim what was always mine, and the knowledge that my worth was never dependent on anyone else's recognition of it. The sun was setting as I drove home, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded me of the pottery glazes I had been experimenting with in my evening classes. I had plans for the weekend, dinner with friends, a new book I wanted to read, a hiking trail I hadn't explored yet. Simple things, but they belonged entirely to me. I thought about calling Margaret to tell her about the promotion opportunity that had just opened up in our sister organization, a chance to lead policy development on a national scale. Sarah would have hesitated, would have wondered if she was qualified enough or experienced enough or simply enough, but I wasn't her anymore. I was the woman who had learned to read the fine print, who had discovered that the most important battles are often fought in silence, who had realized that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to disappear when others try to erase you. They had tried to delete my name from their story, but they couldn't delete me from my own.